April 23, 1945, 2:17 a.m. Somewhere along the Elbe River, Germany, Corporal Heinrich Müller crouched in the darkness of a collapsed barn, his Wehrmacht uniform filthy with mud and dried blood, his hands shaking as he listened to the voices outside. American voices, speaking in that casual drawl he'd learned to recognize over months of retreat, voices that meant safety if he could just surrender to them before the other sound reached him. The mechanical precision of German boots on cobblestones, the clipped commands in his own language that filled him with a terror far greater than any American rifle could inspire. Because those were the Feldgendarmerie, the German field police, and Müller knew with absolute certainty that if they found him before the Americans did, he would be hanging from a lamppost by sunrise with a cardboard sign around his neck reading defeatist, or deserter, or simply coward. He'd seen it happen to others, good men, exhausted men who'd fought since Poland or France or Russia and had simply reached the end of human endurance. The field police didn't care about your service record, your wounds, your reasons. They cared only about maintaining discipline in an army that was disintegrating, about making examples that would terrify others into continuing a war everyone knew was lost. So Müller made his choice, the choice thousands of German soldiers were making in those final weeks. He stood up, raised his hands above his head, and walked toward the American voices, praying they would see him before his own countrymen did, because surrender to the enemy meant prisoner of war camps and eventual return home. But capture by German field police meant a summary execution and an unmarked grave. This is the story of why, in the final months of World War II, German soldiers feared their own military police more than they feared the Allied armies closing in from all sides. To understand this phenomenon, you must first understand what the Feldgendarmerie had become by 1945, how an organization meant to maintain military order and discipline had transformed into something far darker, a weapon the Nazi regime used to enforce loyalty through terror as their thousand-year Reich crumbled around them. The field police had always been a necessary part of military operations. Every army needs military police to handle logistics, direct traffic, investigate crimes, maintain order behind the lines. In the early years of the war, when Germany was victorious and morale was high, the Feldgendarmerie performed these functions relatively normally. They were recognizable by their distinctive gorget, a metal crescent worn on a chain around the neck, bearing the eagle and swastika emblem, which earned them the nickname chain dogs among regular soldiers. But as the war turned against Germany, as the victories stopped and the retreats began, as casualties mounted and the Eastern Front became a meat grinder consuming entire divisions, the role of the Feldgendarmerie changed. They became enforcers not just of military law but of ideological purity, executors of increasingly draconian orders designed to prevent desertion and maintain fighting capability in an army that was running on fear rather than conviction. By 1944, and especially in 1945 as Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, the field police had essentially become roving execution squads, empowered to hang or shoot on the spot any soldier found away from his unit without proper authorization, any soldier who spoke defeatist words, any soldier who showed insufficient enthusiasm for continuing the hopeless fight. The statistics are grimacing. German military courts and field summary executions killed approximately 30,000 German soldiers during World War II, with the vast majority occurring in the final year of the war. For context, during World War I, which was far longer and even bloodier for Germany, only 48 German soldiers were executed. For military offenses, the exponential increase wasn't because German soldiers in World War II were more cowardly or undisciplined. It was because the Nazi regime, facing inevitable defeat, chose terror as the tool to keep their armies fighting when every rational incentive said to surrender. The orders governing the Feldgendarmerie's actions in the war's final months were explicit and ruthless. Hitler's Nero Decree of March 1945 ordered the destruction of German infrastructure to deny it to the advancing Allies, but it also contained provisions for dealing with defeatism. Any suggestion that Germany should surrender, any failure to fight to the last, was to be punished with death. The field police were the primary enforcers of these policies, working alongside SS units and party officials to create a climate of terror that, perversely, made German soldiers view the enemy as less threatening than their own leadership. Heinrich Müller's story, though his specific details are fictionalized, represents the experience of thousands. He was 23 years old in April 1945, conscripted in 1942, trained hastily, and sent to the Eastern Front, where he'd survived 2 Russian winters, countless battles, 3 wounds, and the complete destruction of his original unit. By early 1945, he'd been reassigned to a makeshift battle group defending approaches to Berlin. Old men, teenagers, remnants of shattered divisions, all thrown together under officers who ranged from grimly competent to fanatically ideological. The collapse was obvious to everyone except apparently the high command. The Soviets were approaching Berlin from the east. The Americans and British were crossing the Rhine and sweeping across Western Germany. The infrastructure that had sustained the German war effort was in ruins from years of strategic bombing. Food was scarce. Ammunition was scarce. Fuel was almost non-existent. And yet the orders kept coming. Hold to the last man, no retreat, fight for every house and street. Germany will prevail through will and sacrifice. Müller watched his unit disintegrate not through enemy action, but through desertion. Men would simply disappear during night movements, would fail to return from patrols, would lag behind during retreats, and vanish into the civilian population or the forests. He couldn't blame them. The war was clearly lost. Why die in the final weeks for a regime that had brought nothing but destruction to Germany? Better to hide, to survive, to see your family again, to live for the peace that was coming whether Germany surrendered or was utterly destroyed. But the Feldgendarmerie was everywhere, strung along every road, checking papers at every crossroads, hanging bodies from every lamppost and tree as warnings to others. Müller had seen them work. A soldier stopped at a checkpoint, his papers checked, some discrepancy found, or some suspicion raised. Questions asked in that cold, bureaucratic tone. Answers deemed insufficient. A quick tribunal right there on the roadside. 3 field police officers acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Sentence pronounced. Rope produced. The nearest tree or lamppost employed. The body left hanging with a sign explaining the crime. Deserter, defeatist, traitor to the fatherland. The whole process taking maybe 15 minutes from initial stop to corpse swinging in the wind. The psychological impact was profound and exactly as intended. Regular German soldiers became more afraid of their own military police than they were of enemy soldiers. This wasn't entirely irrational. If you were captured by Americans or British, you'd be searched, interrogated, fed, and sent to a POW camp. The Geneva Convention governed treatment of prisoners, and while conditions weren't luxurious, they weren't fatal. You'd survive the war. You'd eventually go home. Your family would know you were alive. But if you were caught by the Feldgendarmerie while separated from your unit, even with legitimate reasons, you faced a very real possibility of immediate execution. The standards of proof were minimal. The procedures were summary. Appeals were non-existent. And the political pressure on field police to make examples, to maintain discipline through terror, meant they erred on the side of harshness. Better to hang an innocent man and maintain fear than to show mercy and encourage desertion. The night Müller decided to desert came after witnessing yet another execution. A sergeant from another unit, a man in his 40s who'd been wounded and was trying to make his way back to his family in Hamburg before the city fell, was stopped at a checkpoint Müller's unit was manning. The sergeant had papers, but they were outdated. He had wounds, but they'd healed enough that he could walk. He had reasons, but they didn't satisfy the 3 Feldgendarmerie officers who arrived to investigate. Müller watched them work with sick fascination. The sergeant was calm at first, explaining his situation, sure that reason would prevail. But the field police weren't interested in reason. One of them, a man who couldn't have been more than 30 but had the cold eyes of someone who'd seen and done terrible things, simply interrupted the sergeant's explanation. You are absent from your unit without proper authorization. Under emergency powers granted by the Führer and Reich Military Command, this constitutes desertion in the face of the enemy. The penalty is death. Just like that. No trial. No defense. No consideration of circumstances. The sergeant's calm evaporated. He began pleading, then shouting, then fighting as they dragged him toward a nearby tree. Müller and the other soldiers of his unit were ordered to watch. Another purpose of these executions was to intimidate everyone who witnessed them. They hanged the sergeant using a rope that looked like it had hanged others before, a rope the field police carried specifically for this purpose, worn smooth by repeated use. What struck Mueller most was the bureaucracy of it. After the sergeant stopped kicking, one of the field police officers carefully filled out a form, noted the time and date, the nature of the offense, the sentence carried out. Another attached the cardboard sign to the body. The third took photographs for official records. Then they moved on, 3 men in Feldgrau with their distinctive gorgets, looking for the next example to make. That night, Mueller made his decision. He would not end up hanging from a tree because some field police officer decided his papers weren't in perfect order or his explanation wasn't convincing enough. He would take his chances with the Americans. The front lines were fluid, the situation chaotic. If he could time it right, pick his moment carefully, he could surrender to American forces before any Feldgendarmerie could stop him. The opportunity came sooner than expected. His unit received orders to withdraw to new defensive positions, abandoning their current location to American forces advancing from the west. The withdrawal was supposed to be orderly, but order had become increasingly theoretical in the Wehrmacht of April 1945. Units became separated in the darkness. Officers lost track of their men. The retreat became a chaotic stream of soldiers moving eastward, many of them looking for opportunities to simply disappear. Mueller found his chance when his squad became separated from the main body during the night movement. In the confusion, with officers shouting conflicting orders and American artillery beginning to fall on the withdrawal routes, he simply peeled off from his group. 3 other soldiers did the same, men he'd fought alongside but didn't know well, men who'd clearly reached the same conclusion. Better to take chances as deserters than to continue retreating until they were either killed by Americans or hanged by their own field police. They hid in the collapsed barn as dawn approached, waiting for the American advance to overtake their position. The wait was terrifying because they knew field police often followed behind retreating German units, specifically looking for stragglers and deserters. Every sound made them freeze. Every engine noise could be German or American, life or death, depending on which flag the vehicle flew. Then they heard it, the distinctive sound of German military vehicles, the sharp commands in German, the boots that could only be Feldgendarmerie conducting a sweep. Mueller's heart hammered in his chest. They were trapped. If they stayed hidden and were discovered, they'd be shot as deserters on the spot. If they ran, they'd be shot trying to escape. But then, miraculously, they heard other voices, American voices, an American patrol moving up the same road, the 2 forces about to encounter each other. Mueller made his decision in a split second. He stood up, raised his hands, and walked out of the barn toward the American voices. Behind him, he heard his 3 companions doing the same, all of them making the same desperate calculation: surrender to the Americans before the field police could stop them. The American soldiers reacted exactly as trained. Weapons came up, shouts of hands up, and don't move. Mueller kept his hands high, kept walking slowly forward, shouting the few English words he knew. Kamerad, surrender, please. The Americans were young, probably no older than Mueller, but they looked well-fed and well-equipped in a way German soldiers hadn't looked in years. They patted him down roughly but not cruelly, checked for weapons, zip-tied his hands behind his back. One of them, a sergeant who looked like he was from a farm somewhere in America's heartland, looked at Mueller with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "You guys are surrendering everywhere now," the sergeant said, not really expecting Mueller to understand. "Smart move. War's over for you. You'll be fine." Mueller didn't understand the words, but understood. The tone, he was safe. He'd made it. He was a prisoner of war, which meant he'd survive. Relief flooded through him so powerfully that his legs nearly gave out. The Americans led him and his 3 companions to a collection point where dozens of other German prisoners were being assembled, all of them with the same expression: relief, exhaustion, the incredible lightness of no longer having to fight, no longer having to fear both the enemy ahead and the enforcers behind. The contrast between American treatment of prisoners and German field police treatment of their own men was stark and deliberate. The Americans followed Geneva Convention protocols, viewing prisoners as defeated enemies deserving of humane treatment. German prisoners were searched, documented, given water and food if available, and transported to rear areas for processing. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was shot. Nobody was hanged, as an example. This wasn't purely altruism. Treating prisoners well encouraged more surrenders, which saved American lives and accelerated German collapse. But it also reflected a fundamental difference in military culture. American military justice, while not perfect, operated through courts-martial with real procedures, evidence, and appeals. American soldiers who committed serious offenses were tried, not summarily executed. The American military didn't rule through terror of its own troops. The German field police, particularly in 1945, operated on completely different principles. They were instruments of a totalitarian regime that had always used fear and violence as tools of control, and as that regime faced annihilation, it intensified those tools. The gallows and the firing squad were meant to extract the last possible fighting from an army that had lost faith in the cause, but might still be terrorized into fighting from fear of the alternative. Muller's experience in American captivity validated his decision to surrender. The POW camp he was sent to was crowded and basic. But prisoners were fed adequately, received medical care for injuries and illnesses, were housed in weatherproof barracks, and were treated according to international law. He was alive, safe, and had reasonable expectation of seeing his family again after the war ended. Every German soldier in that camp knew they'd made the right choice in surrendering rather than fighting to the death or being caught by their own field police. But not every German soldier got the chance to make that choice. The Feldgendarmerie, working alongside SS units and Hitler Youth fanatics, continued operating almost until the final German surrender on May 8, 1945. They hanged deserters and defeatists even as Soviet artillery was falling on Berlin, even as American tanks were rolling through German cities, even when the war's outcome was beyond any possible doubt. The stories from those final weeks are harrowing. In Berlin, as the city was encircled and falling street by street to Soviet forces, field police and SS units executed German soldiers found trying to escape the doomed city. In Bavaria, as American forces advanced, Feldgendarmerie officers hanged retreating German soldiers from trees along the roads the Americans would take, ensuring the bodies would be found and documented. In some cases, the executions were performed literally hours before Allied forces arrived, suggesting the motivations had become purely ideological, punishing perceived disloyalty even when no military purpose could possibly be served. The most notorious of these late-war executions involved very young soldiers, teenagers conscripted in the final desperate levies, boys as young as 14 or 15 who were thrust into uniform and sent to face veteran Allied armies. When these children, confronted with the reality of modern warfare and the certainty of defeat, tried to go home or surrender, they were sometimes caught by field police and executed with the same ruthless efficiency applied to adult soldiers. One documented case involved a 16-year-old soldier in Berlin who told his squad he wanted to see his mother one more time before he died. He was overheard by a Feldgendarmerie officer, denounced as a defeatist, and hanged from a lamppost with a sign reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland." His body was left hanging for 3 days before Soviet troops advancing through the neighborhood cut it down and buried it. These weren't isolated incidents. They represented a systematic policy of using terror to extract maximum effort from a military force that had lost all rational motivation to continue fighting. The tragedy is that this terror was often counterproductive even from a purely military perspective. Soldiers who might have continued fighting if treated with basic human dignity instead deserted at the first opportunity or surrendered quickly when faced with enemy forces, or in some cases even provided intelligence to the Allies about German positions and capabilities. The psychological literature on military cohesion and morale consistently shows that soldiers fight best when motivated by loyalty to comrades, belief in the cause, confidence in leadership, and trust that their sacrifices are necessary and appreciated. Terror can compel short-term compliance, but it destroys the deeper bonds that make military units effective. By April 1945, the German military had become an army held together primarily by fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of the consequences of defeat, and most immediately, fear of their own enforcers. Muller would spend almost 2 years in American POW camps before being repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to a country utterly transformed, cities in ruins, economy devastated, occupied by foreign powers, stripped of the territories and power that had made it a threat to the world. He found some family members alive, others dead, his home city of Dresden largely destroyed by bombing. He struggled with the psychological aftermath of war, with guilt over surviving when so many hadn't, with the complicated task of processing what Germany had done and what had been done to Germany. But he was alive to struggle with these things. He was alive to rebuild, to contribute to the new Germany that emerged from the ashes, to have a family and a career and a life. He was alive because in that critical moment in the collapsed barn in April 1945, he'd chosen to take his chances with American soldiers rather than risk capture by his own field police. He'd survived because he'd correctly calculated that enemy soldiers following laws of war were less dangerous than friendly military police following orders to terrorize. His story was far from unique. Tens of thousands of German soldiers made similar calculations in the war's final months, surrendering in droves when opportunities presented themselves, sometimes surrendering to forces they could have continued resisting, sometimes actively seeking out opportunities to surrender. The Allies noticed this pattern. German resistance would be fierce in some sectors and collapse completely in others, often depending on whether Feldgendarmerie units were present to enforce continued fighting or whether German soldiers could surrender without their own side stopping them. After the war, the role of the Feldgendarmerie and other enforcement organs in terrorizing German soldiers became part of the broader reckoning with Nazi crimes. Some field police officers were prosecuted for executing soldiers without proper legal authority, though most escaped justice by blending back into civilian life or successfully arguing they were following orders. The legal and moral questions were complex. Were they war criminals for executing their own soldiers? Or were they themselves victims of a system that made them instruments of terror? The answer probably lies somewhere uncomfortable between those poles. Many Feldgendarmerie officers were true believers in Nazi ideology, volunteers for the role of enforcer, men who took satisfaction in their power over others and used their authority with excessive zeal. But others were career military police who found themselves trapped in a system that demanded increasingly brutal actions, caught between their own consciences and orders backed by the threat of their own execution if they refused. What's undeniable is the effect they had on Germany's military collapse. By making German soldiers more afraid of their own enforcers than of enemy capture, by creating conditions where surrender became preferable to continued service, the Feldgendarmerie and similar organizations accelerated the Wehrmacht's disintegration in the crucial final months. Paradoxically, the terror meant to maintain discipline contributed to faster collapse. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II Germany. Military organizations that rely primarily on fear and coercion rather than genuine loyalty and belief inevitably become brittle and prone to sudden collapse when pressured. Soldiers who fight only because they fear punishment from their own side will seize the first opportunity to stop fighting when that fear can be escaped. Armies held together by terror are armies waiting for the chance to fall apart. The Wehrmacht of early 1940, advancing across France, was a confident force that believed in victory and felt genuine elan. The Wehrmacht of April 1945, defending the ruins of Germany, was a terrorized force held together by fear of its own enforcers, with soldiers actively seeking opportunities to surrender to the enemy. The transformation from one to the other was driven by many factors: military defeats, ideological extremism, leadership failure. But the increasing role of terror as a tool of discipline was both symptom and accelerant of the collapse. Heinrich Müller died in 1987, having lived through post-war occupation, reconstruction, the division of Germany, and the beginning of its reunification. In later life, he occasionally spoke about his war experiences, including that moment in the collapsed barn when he decided to surrender. When asked if he'd been afraid of the Americans, he always gave the same answer: "No. I was terrified of my own field police. The Americans just captured me. My own people would have hanged me." The historian asking him the question once pressed further, "But the Americans were the enemy. How could you fear your own side more?" Muller's response captured the essential truth. The Americans wanted to defeat us. My own field police wanted to terrorize us. There's a difference. Defeat you can survive. Terror just makes you desperate to escape by any means necessary. We weren't really fighting the Americans anymore at the end. We were trying to survive long enough to surrender to them before our own side killed us for trying. That inversion, where soldiers feared their own enforcers more than enemy armies, represents one of the final absurdities of Nazi Germany's collapse. A regime that had conquered most of Europe through military prowess ended with its own soldiers fleeing not from the enemy, but from their own forces, choosing captivity over continued service, seeing surrender as salvation rather than shame. The Feldgendarmerie officers who hanged deserters in those final weeks likely believed they were doing their duty, maintaining discipline, serving the fatherland to the last. But their actions mainly served to demonstrate that the cause was already lost, that the regime they defended had devoured itself from within, that terror could compel obedience but not loyalty, that fear could maintain the appearance of an army but not the reality of one. As the sun set over Germany on May 8, 1945, the day of final surrender, the lampposts and trees that had held the bodies of executed German soldiers stood as monuments not to discipline or loyalty, but to a regime's final, futile attempt to force men to continue fighting for a cause that no longer existed and perhaps never truly had. The soldiers who'd managed to surrender to the Allies before their own field police caught them. Men like Heinrich Müller were the fortunate ones, the ones who'd correctly calculated that the enemy was less dangerous than their own enforcers, that prisoner of war camps were preferable to gallows, that survival sometimes required surrendering not to superior force but to basic sanity. And in the end, perhaps that was the most damning indictment of all, that an army which had once been Europe's most formidable military force finished the war with its soldiers actively seeking capture by the enemy to escape the terror of their own command structure. The Feldgendarmerie hadn't maintained discipline. They'd merely provided final proof that the regime they served had become a death cult, sacrificing its own soldiers not for any military purpose, but simply because the ideology demanded blood, even German blood, even unto the absolute end.